Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's lecture. Today, what I thought I'd do is go over a couple of the more popular theories that some of my former students who've taken this course have decided to use for their final paper. I know we're a few weeks out, but I know I've gotten a lot of requests asking, like, how soon can you start working on your final paper? And so I know some folks are trying to get ahead of that. So I figured I'd go over some of these theories in case it might be useful for you. Both of these can be found on the textbook, the communication theory textbook that I put up on Blackboard. So let's go ahead and get started. The first theory we're talking about is social penetration theory. And I use these gifs because I think for most of us who saw the movie Shrek, when he talked about ogres being like onions, that's the exact perfect metaphor when talking about social penetration theory that was created by Altman and Taylor. So, in terms of social penetration theory, the big kind of focus for this theory was mostly focused on romantic relationships. But my big argument when I've talked to my students is that if you are taking the advice of Denning and the idea of like maybe a transformational leader, you are taking the time to getting to know your team and getting to know your coworkers and anybody that's a part of your team and who you're in charge of, and even in some cases who you're not in charge of, right? Like if you're really thinking about a large scale organization. But oftentimes, especially if you think about some of the article we read for week 2, when we talked about team building and the fact that oftentimes people weren't motivated by money. They were more likely to be creative if they were, given longer lunches and longer tables during lunches. And really it's about communication. And so for me, that's where social penetration theory comes in, because you should be taking the time to get to know your team, right? And developing those relationships. So, social penetration theory is a process of developing deeper intimacy with another person with mutual self disclosure and other forms of vulnerability, right? And that's what we get when we start working with our coworkers. And I think this theory works so well because oftentimes, depending on what job you may have, you're spending more time with your coworkers than you are with your family, depending on what's going on. So, that's one of the reasons why I like this theory so much. And much like what we talked about with Shrek, the big belief behind social penetration is this idea that our personality structure has different onion-like layers. So all of these different layers include our beliefs, our feelings about ourselves and others in the world. And essentially, if you think about like the outer layer of that onion or of our personality, those are the different facets of our personality, right? And there's the variety of different things, right? You think about there could be religion, it could be your politics, it could be your favorite color, it could be your favorite sports teams, like all of those things are different aspects or outer parts of your layer of your personality. But it's not until you start getting to know someone more that you get a little bit deeper into those topics. And that's where we get into self-disclosure, right? So that's the voluntary sharing of personal history, preferences, attitudes, feelings, values, secrets, etc., with another person, also known as transparency. Now, again, if you think about this in terms of our romantic relationships, it's easier for it to make sense. But I absolutely believe you can take that same concept and bring it into your work life. If you think about the first time you went on a first date with somebody, you might touch on a few of these things, right? Like a few of these deeper things, but oftentimes you wait a little bit and you kind of have this back and forth where they may share something personal and then you feel comfortable sharing something personal. Well, the same thing happens in the workplace, right? One of your coworkers might share something going on at home, something going on with their kids, and then you start feeling more comfortable saying, okay, you know what? If you shared that with me, I'm going to share this with you. And like we just went over, right? So there's the depth, which is the degree of disclosure in a specific area of an individual's life. I apologize for that typo there. And the breadth, right? The range of areas in an individual's life over which disclosure takes place. And this picture here will really help you understand what I'm talking about, right? So we all those preferences in clothes and food and music, all the different studies and taste. And all of those things are in the outer layer, but until you start getting deeper or getting to know someone, will you start getting to the deeper aspects of those layers, right? We have like religious convictions and deeply held fears and fantasies, your concept of self and different goals and aspirations. And that's the big difference there between depth and breadth. You might talk about a lot of these topics with your coworkers, but it really depends on your relationship and how much communication and how much disclosure there is with how deep into those topics you will be willing to get. Now, oftentimes people are looking for what's called reciprocity, right? Like, I'm only going to feel comfortable sharing this with you knowing that you've now shared that with me, right? We're always trying to figure out this idea of social exchange, right? Like, you're trying to see, like, what is the potential benefit or cost of me sharing this information with you, right? We think about that all the time, right? Like, even when we go back to that idea of a romantic relationship, when you're on those first few dates, you're trying to see, like, okay, here's something I should know, right? Let's say, hypothetically, you're on a first date and you want to let them know that you were previously engaged or you were previously married, and you're divorced now. Like, that, for some folks, they want to be straightforward and let that out, right? Like, here, let me lay it all on the table for you. But for some folks, they want to wait. Like, how much are you willing to share with me today on this first date? Now, take that same concept into the workplace, right? You're brand new into an organization. You're trying to get to know your team because as a leader, you should know that whatever worked at your previous employer, regardless of how successful you may have been, it's not going to be a one-to-one, like, let me just do exactly what I did over there, over here, right? You're going to need to know your team and know what's going to work and what's not going to work. The only way you're going to do that is by getting to know them, right? So when you start having these conversations, it's important to understand, like, okay, I'm walking into this social exchange. How comfortable do I want my team to be around me? Am I willing to be vulnerable for my team? So then in turn, they're going to be vulnerable with me. And that's that idea of social exchange. Now, here are some rules essentially around social penetration theory, right? The peripheral items are exchanged more frequently and sooner than private information. And that's pretty common, right? You think about, like, you see Bill's Cowboys mug on his desk and you guys talk about sports, or you see, someone's picture of their family, you get a gist of, like, what their family makeup might be. And little small things like that, it's real easy for people to exchange those things. Self-disclosure is reciprocal, especially in the early stages of relationship development, right? Essentially, like, okay, you told me about your previous relationship. Now I feel comfortable telling you about my previous relationship. I feel comfortable telling you about some of the issues I've been having at work, or you tell me that, and I'm going to feel more comfortable telling you about some of the issues I've been having at work, right? You've told me about some of your failures in this industry. I'm going to feel comfortable sharing mine with you. And the benefit of that is being able to grow with your team, right? And understanding that you're opening up the possibility of creativity, learning from each other's mistakes. There's a lot of things that can be, there's a lot of benefits that can be created by this type of social exchange. Social penetration is rapid at the start, but slows down quickly as the tightly wrapped inner layers are reached, right? You're going to hit these levels where people are not going to be comfortable sharing certain things with you, especially if it's the first time that it feels like a leader actually is genuinely curious about them and their lives that are going on, and maybe even some of their failures or some of their worries when it comes to the workplace. Deep penetration is a gradual process of layer by layer withdrawal, and you think about that. It's much easier to think about that concept in terms of, like, a romantic relationship, right? Where you're, as you start realizing that maybe this is not the person that's right for me, you're going to start sharing less and less information with that person. But the same thing goes on in the workplace. If we've all been in a situation where someone's leaving, and they really only have, let's say that person only has a few really close relationships in a workplace, they're going to be less likely to share deep information with some of the other people that are maybe just kind of workplace acquaintances. Now, when it comes to social penetration theory, there's this idea of the minimax principle of human behavior. So people seek to maximize their benefits and minimize their costs. So essentially, when you're engaging into that conversation, you're trying to figure out what's the best way that I can get the maximum amount of benefit from this conversation without giving away too much, right? Especially in a leadership position, you are trying to find that fine line of, like, here I am being vulnerable with my team, but I still need them to respect me and know that I'm the right person to lead them, right? That's essentially how you should be walking into these conversations is, I want to be open and honest with my team, but I also want to make sure that they know that I'm not only concerned with being their friend, right? I'm their boss first and their leader first, but that doesn't mean I'm not unavailable when it comes to personal things that are going on. So we have this comparison level, right? The threshold above which interpersonal outcome seems attractive, a standard for relationship satisfaction. And then we have the comparison level of alternatives, the best outcome available in other relationships, a standard for relational stability. And what these essentially mean is, and we'll use a romantic relationship first, right? So essentially when you're with someone, you're looking at all the different possible outcomes with this person that seem attractive, right? You're sharing a lot of information and things seem great. However, when you start looking at alternatives, you start determining, is this the best possible situation that I could be in, or is there other opportunities for me, someone else that could be better for me in terms of my dynamic? Same thing happens in the workplace, right? There are some people who are just going to look for opportunities because, career. But there are going to be some folks that, because of the way you're running an operation, or because maybe where they have been previously, they don't like the way things are going. And at a certain point, they have to determine, is this where I want to stay based on the conversations and the relationships that I've created, or is there a better alternative for me? Okay, so that's essentially social penetration theory. Now, the next theory we're going over is speech codes theory, and this is something that I actually used for my dissertation. So speech codes theory was created for two purposes. One, distill what could be learned from a large body of fieldwork research on culturally distinctive ways of speaking, and provide a focus for further research and discussion. Now, the easiest way, and we're going to go over the actual definition, but essentially when it comes to speech codes theory, which works really closely with the ethnography of communication, is that anywhere that there's a unique speaking community, which is essentially almost any community, there's going to be different rules for speaking. Now, we're not just talking about grammar rules. There's a number of different verbal and nonverbal communication rules that are going on, and that's what they're looking at with speech codes theory. Now, the ethnography of communication, for those who've never heard the word ethnography, it's really just a fancy word for in-depth, rich observation. Usually if someone is doing an ethnography, they kind of hunker down somewhere for like 3 to 6 months. They're observing, taking notes, transcribing their own notes, because they're really trying to observe someone's way of life. So you can combine those two together, and observing folks' verbal and nonverbal communications, you start to understand some of the speech codes that they use in their community. So here are some of the defining characteristics of speech codes theory. It's grounded in the observation of communicative conduct in a particular time and place. And it posits a way to interpret and or explain observed communicative conduct, and provides a general understanding of communicative conduct. So all that being said, what is a specific speech code? It's a system of socially constructed symbols and meanings, premises and rules pertaining to communicative conduct. So one of the examples that I'll use is one of my mentors. What she did for her dissertation was she went and looked at a construction company in Mexico. And her only big focus was how people use the word tú, or the words tú and usted. For those who don't speak Spanish, they essentially mean the same thing. That you're talking about someone and using the word you. But there's a lot of different contexts when it comes to tú and usted, whereas tú is more of an informal word, use of the word you. Usted is much more formal and used as a sign of respect. And she wanted to see what kind of rules for those words were being used in this construction company. For me, I wanted to choose something that I'm really interested in, and I'm really interested in football, and specifically fantasy football. And so for me, I was trying to figure out, okay, what are some of the rules in place for some of these fantasy football analysts that may even be a little bit different from just regular NFL analysts, right, who are looking at specifically the costs and the benefits and the strategies going on with fantasy football. So for me, I ended up looking at 36 hours, listen to and just transcribe 36 hours of fantasy football podcasting to kind of figure out what are some of these rules for speaking. And that's what speech codes theory is all about. So you can see why a lot of my former students ended up using speech codes theory, because in almost every industry and every organization, there's going to be a type of speech code being used. So here's one of the propositions of speech code theory. So wherever there is a distinctive culture, there is to be found as a distinctive speech code, and usually multiple speech codes. In every given community, there's going to be multiple speech codes deployed, especially when you consider the fact that there are going to be verbal and nonverbal speech codes. A speech code implies a culturally distinctive psychology, sociology, and a way of speaking. The significance of speaking is dependent upon the speech codes and by inside members to constitute the meanings of communicative acts. That is their formal definition, and essentially what that is saying is no one has made or created oftentimes these rules for speaking. It's kind of like an inherent way that members speak to one another, and that's why the observation portion of the ethnography of communication with speech codes theory is so important. Because essentially you don't have to look it up in a rule book. You can just see from the community members speaking to one another that these are actual speech codes and communicative acts. The terms, rules, and premises of a speech code are inextricably woven into speaking itself, right? Like I said, there isn't oftentimes there isn't a formal rule out there for you need to do this when you're speaking to this person, or this is how we communicate that to one another. Oftentimes it's just people doing what they do. I know in my own experience teaching in this program, about 80 to 85% of our students are in the military, and we typically, aside from what's going on now, we teach on Fort Bliss, right? And so given that we're on base and I'm speaking with a class that the majority are in the military, I can't tell you how many times students start speaking to one another and they use a lot of acronyms, right? And once they start going, like I've lost. I'm like, I don't know what you guys are talking about, but it's a language and a speech code that's very easy for them to kind of communicate with one another. And if you're not a part of that speech community, it's really easy to get lost. And lastly, the artful use of a shared speech code is a sufficient condition for predicting, explaining, and controlling the form of discourse about the intelligibility, prudence, and morality of a communicative conduct. Essentially, once you start understanding what these speech codes are and how to use them, it's going to be a lot easier for you to start communicating with that community, right? So taking that into the leadership role, like especially if you're getting dropped into a brand new organization, one of the things you got to figure out is how do people communicate with one another? What is the best possible way of getting my message out to my team in a way that they're going to be receptive to it and understand it? And so you can see why it's important for leaders to be in a position and create a situation where they're prioritizing communication. They're prioritizing kind of like that open door policy where people can come in and talk to them, where you can kind of combine the two, right? Where you're trying to get to know your team, and in getting to know your team, you're also understanding some other ways for speaking. So these are two of the biggest theories that many of my former students have used. I hope this lecture was beneficial to you. If you have any other questions about these theories or would like some more information, maybe some articles that would help, feel free to shoot me an email. I'd be happy to send them to you.